So where are they sitting Shiva? In now?
Okay, good morning. Chag Sameach, everybody. Happy Israel Independence Day. I hope you're eating your fill of falafel today. There are many, many issues dividing Israel politically, religiously. But despite all the differences, Israel is one of the modern miracles of our age. But when Zionism first started, it was not greeted with open arms by certain members of the Jewish community. And we have to understand that in terms of some of the ways it's playing out today. The religious community, the Rosh Yeshiva, the Gedolim at that time, were very worried, very concerned that this new secular Zionist movement would somehow have the same effect as the Shabtai Tzvi movement a century earlier. Because the Shabtai Tzvi movement was a false messianic movement. It split the Jewish community terribly, caused terrible damage. And even though there was a religious Zionist movement prior to Theodor Herzl, the Chovevei Tzion, which a number of Rabbanim did endorse, because they were limited in their influence, it never caught on. And it kind of died away. I mean, you had some great Rabbanim involved, Rav Shmuel Moliver, Rabbi Yehuda Hai Al-Kalai, a number, even the Netziv was involved. But it never caught on. And as a result, its influence kind of waned. And when Theodor Herzl started the Zionist movement, it caught on, especially in the aftermath of the Dreyfus affair. But the religious community was afraid that returning to Israel was a quasi-messianic movement, and they were afraid that it would disrupt the fabric of Jewish life the way Shabtai Tzvi did, and that's why they were opposed to it. Not so much, as some people would say, because it was run by secular socialists. That wasn't the real issue. They were afraid that it would be a messianic movement once again. And that's why you have in Israel today opposition to Medinat Yisrael. Everybody loves Eretz Yisrael, no religious, non-religious sect, but Medinat Yisrael, the political entity, as before the arrival of Mashiach, was not something that the religious community endorsed. Therefore, that's one of the reasons why you have this split in the Jewish community, particularly when it comes to the area of serving in the Israeli army, in Sahel. When the state was proclaimed 75 years ago, the feeling of Ben Gurion and others was that this Orthodox community in the Yishuv would die out. The Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox Hasidic community, the descendants of the Vilna Gaon who established the Yishuv and all the religious practices in Israel, that would die out. Now we have the strong, modern Israeli Chalutz and the pioneers, and they're going to take over Israel, and this religious fragment of people will just kind of peter away. Which is why he had no problem exempting people engaged in the study of Torah from serving in the army. Because there were maybe a couple of thousand guys in yeshiva in 1948 in Israel. He never in his wildest imagination thought what we see now would happen. The ultra-Orthodox are expanding, they're growing in numbers, putting aside the Hesder yeshivos and the modern Orthodox, but the ultra-Orthodox who don't serve in the army are growing in numbers by leaps and bounds. And it's a serious concern. The army is the great leveler in Jewish society in Israel. And from the army, most people establish friendships, get jobs, careers, and so forth. So I want to focus on some of the perspectives on Sahal from a halachic point of view. And this is, I guess, I gave this lecture at the height of the Vietnam War when I was working in Canada. I didn't escape the draft in Canada. I was working in Canada, but many people went to Canada to escape the draft. So I spoke about draft exemptions in halacha in 1970, 69, 70. So we'll talk a little bit more about it now because it's still an issue. It may not be Vietnam, but it's certainly Sahel. And there are a number of issues involved in serving in the army in Israel. There's the issue, first of all, the halachic status of the army. Does it have a halachic status? Who gets exempted? Who must serve? If we have time, the intersection of bitachon and hishtadlus, the fact that we have to have faith in God, but heaven helps those who help themselves. We have to make certain efforts in that regard as well. So let me start with the Torah. That's always a good place to start. And the Torah talks about draft exemptions. And in the, where are we? Yeah. So in Kiseitse, the Kohanim, the chaplains of the army would say, the Deborah Shoftim Ala'am, the following people are exempt. About somebody who just built a new home and has not yet moved in, let him go home. Because he might die in war and never get the pleasure of living in his new home. And someone else will move into the house. Somebody who just planted a vineyard or planted a garden or planted a crop, and he hadn't yet had time to harvest the crop. Let him go home and harvest his fields, because someone else should take the advantage of his hard labor. So, somebody who just got engaged and hasn't gotten married yet, he should go home. He's exempt from the war. Someone else shouldn't marry his fiance. And they go on and on. So, and the last category is mi ha'ish hayore v'rachaleva. If somebody is, I'm going to say the word coward, but somebody is afraid to go to war. Psychologically, he's afraid of the noise and the shouting and the horses. And that. Let him go home. He's going to be a bad influence to everybody else. These are the draft exemptions. They're common sense exemptions in the Torah. Nowhere does it say somebody who's sitting and learning Torah is exempt from going to war. Doesn't say that. The Torah gives other exemptions, but not that. Now, first of all, we have to understand what is war. There are different types of war, and the Rambam and the other poskim discuss this in great detail. There are two types of war. What's that?
What does the Torah say about the
Well, okay, so when the Torah is talking about a war here, these drafting, I'll come to that in a moment. The draft, I'll do it now. The draft exemptions that the Torah is talking about are for what they call a milchemes reshus, an optional war. An optional war means a war that you want to expand your territory.
Not the war against.
No. There's two types of war. There's a milchemes mitzvah and a milchemes reshus. Milchemes reshus, you can get exemptions for. Milchemes mitzvah, when the land is threatened, or if you're being invaded, or someone's attacking you, everybody goes. Everybody goes. I mean, what is the language here? Gemara and Sota tells us. Where do these exemptions apply? B'milchamos reshus. Aval b'milchamos mitzvah. Hakol yotzim. Afilu choson mechadro v'kala mechupasa. Everybody goes, men and women. That's the women serving the Israeli army. Men and women, even a bride and a groom, for a Mechemes mitzvah. All right? So there are very specific guidelines. The question is, we can get into technical details of the machloksim, Chazal, in terms of how you define these wars, but basically, when the Jewish people are attacked or they're in danger, then all bets are off. Everybody goes. Everybody goes. Right now, there are no active wars in Israel. We're not at war, technically. Hold on. Right now, we are not, no one is attacking the country, no army is attacking Israel now. However, there are many schools of thought, most schools of thought would say that the current situation, there's an existential threat facing Israel now. Because at any moment, whether it's terrorists, whether it's the PLO, whether it's Fatah, whether it's other Arab terrorist groups, they can attack. Israel, unfortunately, is in a permanent state of war because the indisputable fact is Israel only has to lose once and it's game over. They only have to lose once. Hasn't happened yet. Hope it'll never happen. And you look at all the major wars and all the minor wars that they fought, they've won. But all they have to do is lose once and Israel's finished. So therefore, if Israel is in a permanent state of milchemes mitzvah, not that they're being physically attacked, but they are in threat or they're in danger of being attacked. Look, let's face it. If the enemies of Israel see Israel in a weakened position, they will attack. It's a fact of it. You can't ignore that. Therefore, there are no draft exemptions. Period. Sof pasuk. However, here's where, again, we can get into technical details whether the Bezdin has to authorize a war or not. A Mechemes mitzvah, Bezdin does not have to authorize the army to go to war. The Mechemes reshus, Bezdin has to authorize. So the question is the Knesset considered like a Bezdin or like the Din of Melech today? Most poskim would say that the Knesset in most areas other than religion would have the status of a Melech, or in the sense of approving battle plans for a Mechemes reshus. Mechemes mitzvah doesn't require it. Well, yes, but when there was a Sanhedrin, they had to approve Mechemes reshus, not Mechemes mitzvah. Mechemes mitzvah, everybody understands the need, and you don't wait for deliberations. Now, yeah. Well, given the fact that Israel is in a perpetual state of under threat of warfare, then the standing army has to be prepared all the time.
No, but I mean, everybody, without exemptions, should have basic training so that if there's a Mechemes mitzvah, they're ready for fight.
Yeah,
Because you don't have time to train them.
I would tend to agree. But there are two schools of thought in Israel. Before we get, there's a little background. In the Middle Ages, however, throughout Europe, and in some of the Muslim countries as well, people who sat and studied all day long, Torasa Nasa, that was a technical term. Their job was to learn Torah. And we're not talking about 18-year-old kids. We're talking about mature adults. Yeshiva students in Europe who spent their lives studying Torah were not kids. They were mature men. They were supported by the community. And these are great Talmidei Chachamim. For people who spent their entire time studying Torah and who were acknowledged as Torah scholars, they were given certain exemptions. They were exempt from certain taxes. In some case, they were given what was called a ma'arufia, a monopoly on certain businesses. If a person, for example, the Chafetz Chaim, everybody agreed he was a Talmid Chacham, Torasa Naso. He ran a little store, but he kept the store open only as long as he earned enough money for the day Then he closed the shop because he knew everybody was going to come to his store as opposed to the guy down the block. He didn't want to deprive the guy of business. In the Middle Ages, they would grant Talmidei Chachamim monopolies in certain businesses. If you sold thread, if you sold potatoes, then you were the only one allowed in that town to have that business. So you could support yourself in order to study Torah all day. So they were granted certain exemptions. As a result of that, the notion came down that when Israel came into being, that yeshiva students, at that time there were only a few thousand of them at best, should be exempt from serving in the army because their study of Torah also protects Israel. Now we can go into a whole philosophical discussion about the protective aspect of Limud Torah, but as again, there's bitachon and there's hishtadlus. You have to have faith in Hashem, but at the same time, you have to do your part. Now, there are two schools of thought. I'll try to summarize it. The Chazon Ish, great authority, died in 1953. He said that Melchemes mitzvah, or Melchemes chova, as he puts it, obligatory war, only exists when you're actually being attacked. Not the fact that you're in a state of war, the potential of being attacked. If you're actually being attacked, okay?
So how would you have looked at the 67 war?
So he would say let me answer the question. A pre-active attack would be considered a Melchemes Reshus, even if there is a threat. That's the Chazon Ish. I'm not defending it, I'm just stating what his opinion is. And based on the Chazon Ish, the yeshiva world has clung to that fact and insisted on exemptions for all those studying yeshivas. Now, I have no problem if there are great rabbinic scholars who wouldn't know which way to point the gun if you gave them one, and if they were Talmidei Chachamim and they're learning Torah, I have no problem. My problem is all these young men who sit in yeshiva until they're 40 years old, which is the maximum draft age, to get out of serving in the army. Most of the time, they're not sitting and learning. They're bottling, do whatever they're doing. And as a result of being out of the workforce for so long, they can't find a job. It's a burden on the community to support them. Those are the ones, I mean, if there was some type of a test for people sitting in yeshiva to see if you're really on that top level, I would have no problem. But the vast thousands and thousands of young men sitting in yeshiva don't qualify for that level of learning. My personal opinion. Anyhow, that's the Chazon Ish, that's the Hander Hatter. So, Rav Hershel Schachter, as an example, so he writes that even if there's not an actual attack, but if there's another country that claims that they want to take over your country, and that makes it into a Melchemes mitzvah. The Arab world has not accepted the existence of the state of Israel. So from that perspective, an existential Melchemes mitzvah, Melchemes chova, exists all the time, and therefore they should not have a blanket exemption.
Is he qualified that since the Abraham Accords?
The vast majority, no, the vast majority of Arabs, even those who want to live at peace with Israel, okay, in their heart of hearts, they would rather not. They would rather not. And they could turn on a dime. There's a lot of literature on this. When Moshe is told to count the Jewish people, for example, the purpose is to know how many people are available to fight in the war, in the army. When they were ready to fight Midian, they had to be drafted, so to speak, because they didn't have a standing army. When Shmuel warns the Jewish people about the dangers of appointing a king, one of the problems of a king is that you have to have an army working for him, even in peacetime. So it's a whole discussion about that.
Because the Rambam said that first you appoint the king and then you attack.
Well, first you have to appoint Yeah, because Amalek represents a real threat, not a theoretical threat. So in terms of the draft exemption that goes on today, aside from the sociological impact that this has on the Jews who do serve in the army, the one bright light in trying to minimize this conflict between two groups of Jews, the secular Jews and the religious Jews, is the Hesder Yeshiva movement, which started in 1955, 4. In the Hesder Yeshivas, of which there are many in Israel, the students who learn in the yeshiva serve in the army as well. Then they come back to the yeshiva. They don't serve as long, perhaps, but they distinguish themselves, and a lot of them are involved in some of the more elite army units. I remember once I was visiting yeshiva in Nahariya, Hezbollah yeshiva in Nahariya, near the border with Lebanon. The yeshiva was called Nahar Deya, interesting, after the town of Babylonia. And I was davening there one morning, and a young man had just come back from his army service to come back to resume his studies in yeshiva. And there was singing and dancing and welcoming him back, and it was wonderful, because some of the other guys were about to leave the following week. But this concept of being able to learn and serve in the army goes a long way in trying to bridge that gap which exists. The ultra-Orthodox are never going to bridge that gap.
How about Nachal Haredi?
Nachal Haredi is a beginning. I was going to get to that. The Nachal Haredi is an attempt. There are members of the Haredi community that are willing to serve in the army, and they are unfortunately blackballed by their own homes, their own communities. It's very when they go home on leave, they risk their lives by wearing their army uniform. They switch out into their black clothes before they go home, because they are outcasts in their own community. But the Nachal Haredi is set up for Haredim with the long payas and everything else to serve in the army. It's their own. It's not a co-ed division. It's all for men, which is one of the reasons why they don't serve in the army, by the way. And it's making slow inroads because they themselves realize that not every member of the Haredi community is destined to be a Talmud Chacham or a Gadol B'Yisrael. There is a value to sit and learn, yes. But not everybody has the capacity to become the Gadol Hador. Those are the ones that should be exempt. No problem with that. But the average run-of-the-mill guy who sits there and smokes his cigarettes all day long and takes 3-hour lunch breaks, I can't justify. Personally, I can't. The religious movement, of course, pushes for it. They don't want, again, I don't know if you want some of these guys handling a rifle. I don't, very honestly. However, they, Beshita, as a point of philosophy, as a point of pride, refuse to serve because they don't recognize the state of Israel. The land of Israel, yes, the state of Israel, even though it gives them welfare checks, they don't recognize it. They don't recognize it.
Wally, so on that point, do you care to talk about Dina Malchus Dina?
Of course you can. Dina de Malchus Dina, the law of the land. They don't recognize them. They don't recognize the law of the land. The only authority that they have is their rabbis. And if their rabbis say they don't serve, they don't serve.
No, but the obvious question is, Dina Malchus Dina is halacha. I don't care if it's Israel or ever.
You are 100% correct. And try discussing that with somebody. I've had that discussion and it's gone nowhere. The rabbis say it and that's it. Whether it conflicts with the halacha, if the rabbi says it, it's got to be right. And if their rabbi says, I remember in 1967, after the 6-Day War, so the Satmar Rebbe wrote a book, Ala Geula Vala Tumura, in which he claims that the victory in 6-Day War was the work of the devil, Masa Satan. It's a horrible book. But the Satmar Hasidim loved it. And I had just gotten married And I lived across the street from a shul. And sometimes if I got up late on Shabbos morning, I didn't want to go to shul late, so I walked 3 blocks to the Satmar Shtibel, which started davening much later. And I met a fellow there who I knew, and we got into a discussion about the Satmar Rebbe's position. And I don't know if he actually read the book, but if the Rebbe said it, that's it. If the Rebbe said it, who am I to question the Rebbe? He knows. He has Ruach HaKodesh. And you can't have a logical discussion with something that is so emotionally laden. And it's a point of pride to oppose the state of Israel. It's a point of pride to say, I will not serve in the army. It's secular, and I'm not secular, I'm religious. The fact that we have so many biblical heroes that were military heroes. Look at Yoshua, of all people. Yoshua was a general. Look at all the great generals in Tanakh. They fought to preserve the land, to conquer the land. Okay, now, there's another interesting question, which I don't want to go into too much detail. Do students of Torah have special protection because of the Torah? How much protection does the Torah itself offer? And there's a lot of discussion on that too. There's a fascinating Gemara, 2 Gemaras actually, that are interesting. I'll just put it out there, do with it what you will. More in Shavuos, Daf Lamed Hey, says that Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest of all men, Shlomo HaMelech, for every 1,000 soldiers in the army, he had 200 rabbis learning to protect them. For every 1,000, he had 200 learning. And then the Gemara also states in Sota Daf Yud that the king Asa was punished because he drafted Talmidei Chachamim into battle. So these 2 Gemaras are front and center in the ultra-Orthodox pantheon of opposition. There's a lot of this, again, we're not going to convince them, and of course, they're not going to convince us. Now, Rav Yitzchak Herzog, one of the early chief rabbis, he says, Talmidei Chachamim, as I mentioned earlier, Talmidei Chachamim should be exempt, but not every yeshiva student falls into that category. And Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, his yard site was last Shabbos, he says that the Gemara is talking about communal expenses and supporting an army. So he has a technical discussion, but basically he says military service. And this is an interesting chap that he has. Military service, he says, is a form of chesed that affects and benefits the entire Jewish people. And everybody is required to do chesed. So he doesn't get involved in the halachic discussion about draft exemptions. He simply says, serving in the military, protecting the people, it's an act of chesed. And everybody has to do chesed. And he was a Rosh Yeshiva, one of the most important heads of yeshivas, Gush Etzion. Yeah.
I'm going to interject something that's like, if you want to say for another time, that's fine. But we're talking about, the Haredim or whatever not serving because the Tzahal is secular and all this kind of stuff. The one thing that I know people to whom this has happened is they're raised sort of what we would call modern Orthodox or whatever. And until Tzahal would get up and daven and house tefillin every day and everything. And then they're put in a unit where they're the only firm person.
Right.
And as a result, for some of them, they stop davening because they're ostracized or means getting up so much earlier, and there's no idut from anybody else because they're the only ones in the unit. And that's also an issue.
100%, because, but That's why the Nachal Haredi was established.
But there's a difference between.
Yeah, I understand.
A quote, modern Orthodox might not feel.
I understand. Look, that in general exists in every area of endeavor, not just in the army. It used to be in the 50s and 60s, part of the 70s maybe, that you never saw people wearing yarmulkes in the workplace. You never had minyanim in every store downtown. You didn't have a shiur at lunchtime. Didn't have that. Today, it's much more accepted. So it's always a challenge if you are a religious person working in a non-Jewish or anti-Jewish or secular environment to maintain who you are. I went to a guy's office once, and he's sitting there without a yarmulke, but he had svarim on his desk. And when lunchtime comes, he closes the door, puts on his yarmulke, washes the benches, but that was life. And the fact that the secularizing aspect of the army is real. You put into a unit, very often there are co-ed units, very often, I mean, you have to machal Shabbos under certain circumstances, but it depends on the individual, and it's a challenge. It's a challenge for anybody who is observant, who is working in a secular field, a secular area. Today, it's in America, at least, in certain cities in America, it's much easier. In the Israeli army, it's becoming better. It's becoming better. But it's a challenge for a person who is frum to be in a unit where he's the only frum person. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. And that's why the chaplaincy corps of the Israeli army is kept very busy, trying to keep these guys in line. Yeah.
Safety in numbers, the more from people that are in the army.
Okay. Now, I want you to know that in the, what do they call the top military units? The general, the top unit, the top supervisory, I forget what it's called in the army. There are more and more kippot in the general staff. On the general staff of the army, there are more and more kippot. For one of my granddaughters' bat mitzvah project, she wanted to raise money for soldiers. There's a special group, the Duvdevani unit. Duvdevani unit is undercover soldiers who look like Arabs, who go into the Arab cities to arrest bombers, to take people out, whatever. It's a very top secret unit. We went in there, we couldn't take any pictures, right? We watched them train. We got special permission to go in there. During lunch, we sat down with the soldiers to eat lunch. And at the staff table, the commander of the unit has a kippah. And 3 guys at the table with him had a kippah. And they bench Mezuman. And this is one of the top secret units, undercover units in the Israeli army. And the day that we were there, a new group came in. Out of every 200 that begin training, I think 70 come out and pass. And there were many kippot with sitters out there training that day.
Many years ago, my oldest niece, she was in the Air Force, and they had this, she was doing like an officer's thing. It was the whole tekes at La Troop, and we went, and she got permission, she had to get very special permission to have a special skirt made for her down to the floor with extra fabric so she could actually march, because she wanted to prove to everyone at La Troop that came to this tekes that from women, young women, can serve in the military, and it was so blatantly obvious because she was
Right. So if you go to, I forget the name, there's a new museum in Tel Aviv that replaced the Museum of the Diaspora. I forget what it's called. But there's a wonderful exhibit there about different Jews in Israel. And there's a lot of emphasis on frum Jews doing different things. And there's one vignette, and these are actual people speaking to you. They have, I don't know how to do it mechanically, whatever, but there's a woman, it's a live diorama, actually. Anyway, there's a woman who is, she trains snipe, something in the army, she trains snipe, very high level army position. But this is a woman who keeps kosher, she keeps Shabbos, young woman, she comes from Passaic, a frummy from Passaic. She's not wearing a skirt, I will say that, but she can't because of what she does. But she trains soldiers, but she is and they show this in the museum. 100% religious woman. So they're more and more being integrated into the army, and it's a wonderful thing. Last thing I wanted to point out, Shevet Levi, for example. Shevet Levi is exempt from almost everything. But because they're involved in Avodas Hashem, they're the Kohanim, they serve in the Mishkan. They didn't go to war because they were exempt because of their other involvement in the type of avoda that they do. And however, the Sifri states that even Shevet Levi went to war against Midian, which was considered to be a Melchemes mitzvah. So there are difference of opinions as to how exempt even Shevet Levi would be in terms of the war. So you have, again, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer, who used the posek for Shaarei Tzedek Hospital for many years. He says that Shevet Levi and Talmidei Chachamim are exempt from regular military service. However, in pikuach nefesh situations, such as Melchemes mitzvah, being attacked or in a siege, they have to be involved. Even Shevet Levi, Talmidei Chachamim go to war in that situation. So again, and Lichtenstein again chimes in that there's no source to say that Shevet Levi is exempt from military service. If a bride has to leave her chuppah, Shevet Levi has to leave the Mishkan as well. So again, the Hezer program, the involvement of more and more people in the army goes a long way towards bridging that gap. But it's still, we have a way to go. The philosophy is not so much against serving in the army, although that's an important piece there. It's much more comfortable sitting in a nice warm base medrash and smoke your cigarettes all day. However, it's a question of how integrated they are into the fabric of Israeli society. They don't want to be integrated into the fabric of Israeli society because it is not part of their messianic vision. The state of Israel as opposed to Eretz Yisrael, that's the debate. Eretz Yisrael, everybody loves. The political state of Israel, when Mashiach comes, then we'll have a state of Israel. But until then, they don't recognize the authority of anybody else except their rabbis who interpret the Torah to their benefit. Again, just to summarize, real Talmidei Chachamim should be exempt from serving the army. I have no problem. We need Torah leaders, we need Torah scholars. But not every yingle studying in a yeshiva or attending yeshiva or sitting in a base medrash part of the day until he's 40 years old, and that part of the workforce, it becomes a burden and it only exacerbates any negative feelings that the secular majority of Israel has towards the religious. The fact that you have more religious people involved in the government now, on one hand, it's a plus, but on the other hand, it's also a negative because perhaps people don't agree with some of their policies. Yes.
Kind of compared this to us going back to the 60s and 70s in terms of a person going into the workplace. I can tell you from my own personal experience. So I got into the workplace in the early 70s. That my bosses who were religious, meaning they could be Catholics, they could be from, were very into the needs that I had. The Jewish ones that I had that were not from, were not really into the care.
Yeah.
Okay, they weren't supportive of, but if I had a guy who was
Yes.
Catholic,
Well, people understand the importance of religion.
they would listen to you. They would hear, what can I do to help? So I think that's might be part of the problem here as well.
It's a multifaceted problem. Less observant Jews are very often antagonistic to more observant Jews, as opposed to observant non-Jews. When my daughter worked for Anderson downtown, so she would leave work at 2:00 in the winter to get home for Shabbos. So one of her office mates asked her, how come so-and-so leaves at 12:00 all year long? It was an embarrassing question to ask. This guy leaves at, whether it's in the summertime, he leaves at 12:00 every Friday, that's it. And she stays as long as she can to allow her enough time to get home for Shabbos. To people, unfortunately, we are our own worst enemies sometimes. There are people who do things that, impact negatively. Hopefully, on this anniversary of the founding of Israel, we can look forward to a time when there won't be a need for a standing army, and these questions will be simply academic. So enjoy the rest of the day with your falafel or whatever other way you're celebrating today. If you haven't said Hallel yet, I encourage you to do so. Have a great day and a Chag Sameach.
Did you say half or full?
Full Hallel,
Yeah,
without a bracha.
Without a bro.
we said full also. Anyway, enjoy.